Hello and welcome to Texas Book Talk. I am your host, Heather Renee May, and excited to have you here this Wednesday. And I'm going to introduce you to an author that I met a few years back, and his name is Melvin E. Edwards. And he has written a few books that are just really impactful. And I can't wait to bring him on so we can talk with him about his books, his process, and you can ask him questions. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Melvin E. Edwards, or Mel. I can call you Mel, right?
You can call me Mel. Yes.
Excellent. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on today. I'm looking forward to this.
Absolutely. I'm really excited that we were able to work this out. Um, when I met you in Wimberley, I had picked up a copy of your first, I think this is your first book,
Yes, it
um,
is.
The Eyes of Texans. And this is a gorgeous story, six generational story of your family from slavery to as you put it, from slavery to the Texas Capitol, because you used to actually be a speechwriter for the former governor of Texas.
That is
It,
correct. I
okay,
was a speechwriter for Rick Perry.
Rick Ferry. Okay, so I would love to. I mean, first off, I would love to hear about your journey into writing and your kind of how you got what sparked you to really want to share your story and your family story with other people.
Okay, as a writer, that story goes way, way back. I can't think of other than wanting to be a baseball player. I can't think of any other thing I ever wanted to do. I decided specifically when I was about 12 years old that writing was what I wanted to do with my life. I enjoyed writing even before then, but that was when I made the just determination that that's what I wanted to do. And I never veered from that. Like I was such a nerd in high school. My electives, I would tailor around writing and future careers as a newspaper reporter. I took typing back when typing was a class, and so I could learn how to type fast. I was the only boy in the class. I learned how to write. I took a shorthand class because I wanted to. When I was interviewing somebody, I wanted to be able to write down everything they said quickly. So I was very, very focused when I was a young teenager, and I did get to do all that. I majored in journalism and became a newspaper reporter, and eventually ventured outside of the newspaper world, but it was always within a writing background.
Was there someone in your background or in your history or someone that you had met that like made you like want to do this? I mean,
Not that I recall, which
okay.
is kind of interesting because I my dad died when I was 13 years old, and so I lost all contact with his side of the family. But after writing my books, I've reconnected with some of those family members, and several of them are writers, and I never knew that about them then. So maybe there's some kind of a gene that we possess that created that talent. But yeah, I really developed an interest in writing personally because of I remember a book report when I was 12 years old on Call of the Wild by Jack London, and that's when I decided that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were inspired by him in that book. So tell me about your journey into writing your first book, writing this book. I would love to hear how
Okay,
that came about.
sure. Well, the process goes back to about 1988. The book came out in 2020. So in 1988, I decided to do some genealogy research. And I'm from Houston. That's my hometown. And
Mm,
Houston happens to have one of the largest genealogy libraries in the world.
mm.
And so I decided I would make a trip down there and start doing some research. And I didn't know a whole lot about my family's history more than one or two generations previous. And there just wasn't much information documented in my family. And it just became it was so frustrating that I would do some research and then I'd give up. And then I start again and I'd give up. But I was off if there's such a thing as off and on persistence. I didn't give up completely. So after the internet age started and it was easier to find documents online rather than having to go to a physical building, go to a library, or go to um, your state's Capitol to go to find the records, I was able to find a few more pieces. And one of the things I learned along the way is when you're doing genealogy research, if you find a piece, no matter how small it is, don't dismiss it, because you
Mm.
could find something else later on that makes that little piece make sense. And it took me a while to learn that lesson, because I'd find something that this doesn't really seem to go anywhere. And then I'd later on, a year or two later, I'd find something else and know, well, if I'd kept that first piece, I would have found this much sooner. So doing that kind of research, eventually, and during COVID, a lot of people were able to generate some creative projects during COVID. Had a lot of downtime, and so I decided I would start to write down this information for my children. That was my intention, was to write it for them, not for publication necessarily.
Mm.
And so I just started putting down the information as if you were just writing in a scrapbook. And I thought, that's not very interesting. So I got the idea that I would write it as if my ancestors were actually the ones telling you the stories.
Mm.
And so it was probably like 3 o'clock one morning. I started writing. I got this idea, and then it just kept going. And I wrote faster than I've ever written anything in my life, partially because the ideas were just flowing, but partially because it was one of the more stressful things I've ever done.
Mm.
Because the topic of slavery and trying to get into the mindset of my ancestors, not just thinking about the historical side of it, but the personal side, the day-to-day events, what their family was like, how challenging it was to hold their families together. And at one point, I won't give away too much of the story if somebody's interested in reading it, but my great grandparents were brought to Texas in the 1840s, and they were unusual in that they were married when they came here. They got to stay together as a couple,
Mm.
and they had children after they came to Texas. But unfortunately, their oldest daughter was sold away
Mm.
to a plantation in Louisiana, and the father made it his mission to get his daughter back. And so he's the hero of this first book.
Mm.
And that's a story I'd heard from childhood, and I wanted to flesh that out more. But at the same time, it was so painful. I couldn't, while I was writing about this, I just couldn't sleep. It was just haunting. And so I decided, if I ever want to be able to sleep again, I got to write the story as fast as possible. So
Yeah.
I wrote the entire book in about 3.5 weeks. I
Wow.
and it took me back to the typing class when I was in high school, and I type about 80 words a minute, and so I was writing 3 or 4 thousand words a day, where most people couldn't couldn't do that. And because of my background, I was able to carry out that kind of a schedule, and because it was so compact, that I got it done, and then I could take a breath.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, and I love that each chapter is like this, a different point of view from a different, relative, it seems, and, I haven't I haven't finished it, but, I there were parts of it so far that, it's hard for me to read thinking about, like, Juneteenth and your relatives, like, not even realizing they were free, for 2 years, and just, being part of that celebration. That's something that that's a Texas thing, it's a Houston area thing, or it's Galveston thing,
Mhm.
and it's something that I didn't really know much about. And so, yeah, I can only imagine how hard it would be to it's hard for me to read, but I can only imagine how hard it would be to be, kind of inhabiting those voices and the history yourself as you're writing. Yeah.
Yeah, and part of the character, Isaac Blayton, who was my great grandfather, and I
Mhm.
say character as if it's a fiction book, but it was entirely nonfiction. But trying to inhabit his personality, although I'd never met him, I've heard stories about him. I was able to find some information about him. He The only reason I know that my family was in Texas in the 1840s during the Republic of Texas days was because of a single document I found from Isaac Blayton from 1867. So only 2 years after Juneteenth, emancipation for him in Texas. he had been a blacksmith during his enslavement, and he was able to start a business using that skill that he had developed. And he bought some property, which was very rare for a formerly enslaved person in Texas, but that allowed him to vote. And so in 1867, he was listed in the county voting rolls, and I was able to find that document. And as a part of the documentation, you have to tell how long you've lived in that city and how long you lived, or in that county, and how long you lived in the state. And he posted on there that he had lived in both the county, which is Leon County, between Dallas and Houston, and Texas for 23 years. So that took me back to 1844. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to find anything before 1865. And his name, or no other names of my relatives, were even listed by name in the U.S. federal census until 1870. So even finding something as early as 1867 before that 1870 census was pretty rare.
Yeah.
And I was able to use that documentation to apply for and was admitted to the Sons of the Republic of Texas. And I'm one of the very few African American members of that organization. And it certainly wasn't because there was a rarity of Black people in Texas, but because most people don't have a paper trail. And if it hadn't been for my 30 years of research, I probably wouldn't have discovered it either.
We talk about a needle in the haystack there too.
Absolutely.
There was something in your story about how you ended up in Maryland, not realizing that it was the same place that your ancestors were. Is that right? Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. At the time I wrote the first book, I lived in Maryland and
Mhm.
in the Annapolis area. And as I was concluding my research, um, I, well, like I mentioned, my great 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 grandfather's name was Isaac Blayton, and the person who initially owned him, I even hate using that terminology, was named Blayton, and the town is Blaytonsburg, which is just outside of Washington D.C., and that was only about 10 miles from where I lived at the time.
Isn't that incredible?
And so I went there and was able to find a little bit more information about him, and found out that he was brought across the country. Actually, brought in it. Hard to explain for people to think about it this way. Think about Washington D.C. to Texas being across the country, but in essence, in actuality, it was being brought to a different country. It was an international transaction. So he was brought from the United States to the Republic of Texas,
Mm.
and he was there and raised a family there, and generations of my mother's family lived in that county for about 5 generations, which again made it a little bit easier for me to do research, because most people's families don't live in the same place for that many generations.
Yeah.
And because my mom's family did, all the paperwork was right there. So once I started getting some of the pieces, I was able to eventually find bigger pieces of the puzzle to put it together to formulate this book.
I think it's so amazing, and I think that the fact it's always a testament to me that it's something that should be written is when it comes out quickly. Like, you can have an idea for something, but when it just kind of writes itself, you're onto something as a writer. Like, it kind of takes a life of its own, and I think that it's really brilliant. History is hard enough to really connect with, I think, on certain levels. And so making it such a personal story and a narrative where the characters are actually kind of telling the reader, because you're actually getting to know all of them. You're not just saying, hey, this is so and so and they did this and they, this happened, but they're actually, you made them more personable. And I think it's a really brilliant way of bringing people into the reality and the story as much as possible and into that history. um, I would love to talk about your next book, which is the book that just came out or
Well,
recently.
actually, it came out in late in 2022.
Okay. I have a little overlay of it. It's The
Yes.
Strength of a Thousand Suns. And yeah, tell me about this book.
Okay, that is a similar story, but from my dad's side of the family. So I didn't know nearly as much about my dad's family as I knew about my mom's family. As I mentioned, my dad died when I was 13 years old, so I didn't get a chance to ask him, and I lost all contact with those relatives for a long, long time, decades. And I knew some. He had told me some stories when I was young, and the interesting part about that is my memories of those stories were so sharp, so specific that when he mentioned like the name of a song when he met my mother, he
Mhm.
told me when I was like 5 or 6 years old, and I had never heard the song. I never knew the song. I didn't know who sang it. And then I was talking to my wife about it one day, and then it's the more I talked, the more it started coming back to me. And then I remembered some of the lyrics that he told me. So I went online or on YouTube, and I just typed in the lyrics, and I found the song, and it was exactly like I had remembered it from when I was 5 or 6 years old. And the song was called Lemonade, and it's by Louis Jordan. And it talks about a woman who that this man was looking for a woman who drank nothing but lemonade. Like he hadn't met any yet, but he heard a few were made. And that's how he described my mom. And
Mm.
so that really in a lot of spiritual ways, it reconnected me to my dad, even though he wasn't there. Like the stories that he had told me and the memories that I held on to were so vivid that 50 years later I could still remember the details of the lyrics that he shared with me at bedtime. It was a bedtime story when I was 5 or 6 years old. So I wanted, and another part of that is my dad was my hero, and I wanted him to become other people's hero too. So I wanted to share his family story and what he overcame. And um, while the story he shared with me about meeting my mother being such a positive experience, the stories that he shared with me about his relationship with his dad were the exact opposite. Like
Mhm.
his dad was very um, abusive, and so I start off the book with the bombshell in the very first paragraph. And I don't think it would be giving away a lot if I tell you what happens, because that's how the book starts. Where my dad was 10 years old and he had been faced with another abusive situation from his dad, and he decided he was going to kill his father.
Mhm.
And he got a gun, got one of his dad's guns, rifles. He was hunting. They lived out in the farm, out in the rural area, so he was used to hunting animals. So he knew how to use a gun, and he tried to shoot his dad, but the gun jammed.
Oh, wow.
And that's how the book starts. And then I go from there into him making the decision as a 10-year old that even though he didn't know anything about what being a father was like, he was going to, if he ever became one, he was going to do the opposite of everything he had seen from his father. And
Sure.
so I talked about how that um, became the basis for my relationship with him. And then me
Mhm.
taking that and learning even more about how to be a father and my relationship with my son.
And that's some you know, here you are, you talk about the chain, the generational chain of events, but then you're also talking about breaking some generational like patterns, the negative patterns, and that's super powerful. Um, I would almost think that story would be fiction if you didn't know that it's true. You know, truth is
Yes,
stranger than fiction
truth
sometimes.
truth
Yeah.
is stranger than fiction. When I was writing the first paragraph, I felt like I so inhabited my dad's personality
Mhm.
that when I was writing, I'm sitting here in my home office right now, and this is where I wrote it. I was writing, and I was just like tears flowing down my face without even really realizing it, because I was just focused on what I was putting down on the computer. And my wife came in and was startled that I was crying and wanted to know what was going on. I said, I'm fine. I'm just writing. And it was just like had taken over my whole being as I
Yeah.
was working on that.
Wow, that's super powerful. And so where did the story basically takes you through your father's life and through and into your life or your story or
It does. I talk a lot more about my own story in the first book, because the subtitle, From Slavery to the Texas Capitol part is me.
Mhm.
And so in this book, I talk a lot more about my dad and my son, and
Mm.
I sort of show how the
That
the
through line.
continuation of a legacy, how my dad, who had very little formal education, because he was so determined to change the trajectory of his family, how I had a set of different opportunities than he had.
Mhm.
And because of that, my son had a much different set of opportunities than I have. And I talked about how the lessons that I learned from him, from my father, I was able to pass along to my son. And my son just got married a couple of months ago, and I'm hoping that if he ever has a son, that he would pass along those same types of lessons. And that was another reason why I wrote this book, because I want him to sort of have a blueprint for
Mm.
what can happen, how one change in your life can have a generational impact.
Yeah, and making it more of like a conscious, like a tangible thing rather than just something in passing of like, well, yes, this happened and here we are now, um, but really capitalizing, not capitalizing, but just focusing on that as like using that as a really solid, concrete example of what you can do, that people can change, that you can change the you can transform history and change it and have a really amazing future. And it only takes one
Yeah,
person
right.
to make
It
that
does only
decision.
take one.
And then it's
Yeah,
like that ripple effect.
right. And another thing I want to mention about sort of a line for both books, they're told within historical context. So, and I sort of psychoanalyzed my grandfather in the second book, trying to figure out how somebody could do some of the things he did, not just to my dad, but to his whole family. And the funny thing was, I was kind of worried that I had portrayed him as being too bad of a person. But after the book came out, I a relative who I hadn't talked to in 40 years contacted me and said he was even worse than you portrayed him to be.
Wow.
Like that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. But so then I tried to figure out why he could have been this way, and so he was born in the 1880s. My so just one two generations away. He was born that long ago. So he was just one generation removed from slavery,
Yeah.
and I determined that that had to have some long term impact, as well as alcohol.
Mhm.
And so then I talk about how for and the second book again was specifically on the male line of my family. So how the men in my family have had to navigate through things in society in the midst of historical events that at the time they're living through them, they're not historical events, they're current events. So
Yeah.
I one chapter I talk about my parents voting for the first time.
Mm.
So even though my great 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 grandfather got to vote in the 1860s, those rights were taken away in the 1880s, and nobody in my family got to vote again until the 1960s.
Sorry.
So my my parents voted for the first time in 1965, which was the year before I was born. And so one of my chapters specifically talks about them going to vote for the first time,
Mm.
how it was for them. And this was I had to fictionalize it a little bit so you can get the flavor of what was happening. But this was all based on information that they had told me. And even in my dad died in 1980. So even up until then, my parents were afraid to talk about voting
Mhm.
because in the 1960s, it could have been dangerous if they
Sure.
voted for the wrong person.
Well, and
So,
I feel like it's still that way in some ways,
in some
unfortunately,
ways, it's
you know?
unfortunately it seems to be
Yeah.
coming back around.
Yeah, it is. That's really amazing. I I'm wondering if you have any do you have any writing tips for, because I know I have folks that watch this that um have always wanted to write a story, have always had a story that they just have, you know, maybe not sure about how to go. Do you have any writing tip that you'd like to share?
I do. Actually, I have a couple. I can tell you how I do it, and then I can tell you how you probably should do it.
Okay.
Uh, and my style is a little bit different because I've been a writer my whole life, so I know how to navigate the way my brain works, and it doesn't always work in a direct line. So,
Mm.
like with my second book, the one you showed, the Strength of a Thousand Suns. When I started writing, I wrote the first chapter, and then I wrote the last chapter,
Oh,
and then I filled
interesting.
in between because I knew how I wanted it to start and I knew how I wanted it to end, and then I
Okay.
had to decide which order everything else would play out. So my recommendation, if you're going to write like that, is to just simply write, just get it down, and then
Hmm.
you can figure it out in the editing process. And there's several steps to the editing. It's not just a matter of correct spelling and correct punctuation. It's all the tenor of the story. It's the direction. You want to make sure that it's consistent, obviously accurate. Um, but the way that I would recommend, if I were teaching it to someone, where I would recommend them doing it is to have some kind of an outline. So
Mm.
put one anywhere from 5 to 10 points or something, and decide um, which order they want to go in. And of course, they can alter that as necessary. But just sort of give yourself some direction. If you're not a writer by profession, uh, it may not come as naturally to you, and you need some kind of guardrails. And
Some
so
plotting.
I would recommend an outline for that.
Yeah, yeah. Because they people talk about plotting and pantsing. I've done both. This last book I was more plotted, but then I still pant some things because things change. When you start writing your characters, sometimes things happen. You're like, oh, okay, and so you kind of have to adjust. But I think you're absolutely right. Um, so we're nearing the end of our time already, which it
Oh.
always goes so quickly. I know, but I want you to share with me. So first of all, how can people find your books, and how can people find you?
Well, the easiest way to find the books is on Amazon. They're in a few bookstores around the state of Texas, but the easiest way is on Amazon. And my first book is called, as you mentioned, The Eyes of Texans: From Slavery to the Texas Capitol. It came out in 2020, and then 2022, it's The Strength of a Thousand Suns. Again, my name is Melvin E. Edwards, so make sure you put the E, because there are a couple of other Melvin Edwards, and I've always used that E to sort of honor and distinguish myself from my dad. But
I
his
was
name was
wondering.
Melvin Edwards, so I always use the
Yeah,
E so I can use his name, and I'm not a junior, so he didn't have a middle name.
yeah. No, I
Yeah.
like that a
Yeah.
lot. What about, is it best for people to reach you on a website or on social media, or if they
On
wanted to reach
social media, I'm on Twitter or X, whatever you prefer to call it. I'm at Edwards 21228.
out?
That's
Okay.
um, actually, you can find me on any social media using that Edwards 21228.
Okay. Um, and tell me just real quickly about, you also have a podcast, and in fact,
I do.
you have interviewed me on your podcast, which I'm really
Very
excited about.
recently.
Yes.
Yes, I started the podcast. Well, the idea was initially supposed to be my third book, and I
Mm,
and I started writing, and I got stuck, and so I came up with the idea for the podcast, but I didn't really know what format I wanted it to take, and I decided I wanted it to be a storytelling podcast, and I would interview people, and they would tell me their stories, and then we would just share ideas and share stories. And so my podcast is called Stories from Real Life,
mm.
and it's an opportunity for people to share things that they've done, things that they're passionate about, inspiring stories, pass along information, pass along wisdom. And I have one guest per week, and I invite everybody to tune in wherever you would normally catch your podcast. It's Stories from Real Life. And again, Melvin E. Edwards is how you can find me.
That is awesome. Well, Mel, thank you so much. Hope everyone who's listening to this, either live or later, please definitely find Mel's books and reach out and connect with him and check out his podcast. Again, I'm going to show the latest book, The Strength of a Thousand Suns. So be sure to check that out. And Mel, it's been such a great pleasure talking with you today. And hopefully we'll get to see each other in person at another book event or something in the future.
Yes, that sounds like a great idea, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me on today. I've
Absolutely. It's
enjoyed
my
it.
pleasure. My pleasure. And wishing you all the best. Hoping you have another story or stories in you for another book. So
That sounds great.
uh, thank you, everyone. We'll see you on next Wednesday for Texas Book Talk. Hope you enjoy and have a great